Hello. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Quadrant Report for your survey. And the purpose of this report really is to take the first attempt at taking your survey results and creating something actionable, creating action plans around the results of your survey. Now, the first report that people look at as the results of their survey is usually this Likert report. I have another video that kind of explains this. But what this basically does is just shows you the raw data, the values, the count of respondents who answered 1, who answered 2, 3, 4, and 5 right there. But it's difficult sometimes to know what to do with this. I mean, there's a lot of green, there's some red. It's really sometimes difficult to know where to start in creating action plans around this data. So what the Quadrant Report does is it looks at two pieces of information for each of these questions. And those two pieces of information are the percent top box, or the percent who answered 5, as well as the percent positive, or the percent of respondents who answered 4 or 5. So this question right here, you can see that 6 people answered 5 out of 12 respondents, so 50% of the respondents answered 5, so it has a 50% top box for this question. And then it looks like 10 people answered 4 or 5. And 10 out of 12 is about 83%. So for this one question, you have a 50% top box and an 83% positive. And so we look at those two values for every one of these questions and compare them to the entire survey's top box and percent positive. So in this survey, this school had 28% of all of the responses across all of the questions were 5s, and 77% of all of the responses across all of the questions were 4 or 5. And so when you take those two values for each question and compare it to the values of the overall survey, you can break all of these questions into 4 different categories. And I'm going to really quickly open up this Excel spreadsheet that has one of my favorite tools on it, which is a scatter plot. And I'm going to show you how that works. So every one of these dots on this scatter plot represents one of those questions. And the position of the dot is based on the percent that was top box and the percent that was positive. So this point right here, you can see that this is the one we looked at earlier that was 50% top box and 83% positive. The other thing on this scatter plot are these lines, which represent the survey average for percent top box and percent positive. So this vertical line right here represents the survey average for percent top box. And if you remember, that was 28%. So everything to the right of that line had a higher than average for this survey percent top box. Everything to the left of the line had a lower than average percent top box. This horizontal line right here represents the survey's overall percent positive. It was 77%. And so things above the line had a higher percent positive than the survey as a whole. Things below the line had a lower percent positive than the survey as a whole. And you can see that these questions all end up in one of 4 quadrants, and that's why we call this the Quadrant Report. The first quadrant we can look at right here are those questions that were higher top box and higher percent positive than the survey average. And we'll go back to our Quadrant Report here, and those we've just labeled as your strengths. Every one of these questions had a high percent positive and a high top box. And so these are things that you can celebrate. That's a wonderful first action you can take in response to your survey results, is to kind of celebrate the strengths. And that's what these questions are right here. These represent things that your school is good at, and you can celebrate that. The next quadrant we look at is called this good but not great. And so if we go back to here, that's this quadrant right here. And what this is saying is that the percent top box is lower than average, but the percent positive is higher than average. And so if we go back to our Quadrant Report here, this is really the first look at what you can do with action plans. So all of these questions are things that your school is fairly good at, but people are not answering 5 on those questions. And so as you are identifying strategic priorities for your school, this is where you can start to look. And so, for example, I'm willing to tell a teacher when someone is breaking the rules. A lot of students answered 4 on that question, but not a lot answered 5. And so if you wanted to make a goal around this, you could possibly say that next year when we take this survey, we will have 25% top box on this particular question. And that's just an example of something you can do that is a measurable goal for a strategic plan. And so that's the quadrant 2, this good but not great category. The next quadrant we can look at right here are the ones in the bottom left, and these questions obviously are the ones that are lower than your average top box and lower than your average percent positive. So when we look at the quadrant report here, we call these your areas for improvement. I usually read this from the bottom up. These are your biggest areas for improvement. And then these ones are closer to the good but not great and strengths. But these are your areas for improvement. And so this school helps students resolve conflicts with one another, for example, has a relatively low percent positive and a relatively low percent top box. So these, again, as you are thinking of action plans for your school, these are a great place to look to make action plans. And so you can look at these and say, teachers apply discipline to all students equally. You can make a goal that says next year when we take this survey, we want this to be at least 50% positive, or at least 25% top box, whatever you want to create as a goal there. So those are your areas for improvement. The last one we're going to look at here is kind of a bizarre quadrant, quadrant 4. It's called a house divided, and you can see there's just one question in here. And the way to get into this quadrant is to have a higher than average percent top box, but a lower than average percent positive. And the way to do that is to have a lot of 5s, but then also a lot of 1s and 2s. And so that's why we called this on the quadrant report a house divided, because this could be an indication that there are 2 separate factions in your school, and one of them is very, very happy in this particular area, and one of them is very, very unhappy in this particular area. And when there's sort of that dichotomy, that 2 separate factions, that could be an indication that something is going on with your school that you may want to investigate. No guarantees that there's something wrong necessarily, but it's worth looking at there. As you're looking at this data here and creating your action plans, one thing I do want to say is that this data is based only on your survey. And so it takes the results of your survey as a whole and splits it into these 4 quadrants. So there will always be questions that land in your strengths. There will always be questions that land in your areas for improvement. So as you're making a goal around some of these questions, I would encourage you to make numeric measurable goals to say, we want this percent top box to go up, we want this percent positive to go up, and not make goals around, we want this question to be a strength instead of an area for improvement. And the reason is that as your entire survey improves, again, you will always have questions that land in this areas for improvement. And so I wouldn't want you to be discouraged if your scores are going up, but that question isn't necessarily moving out of this area. So that's just a little caveat with these questions. So that is the quadrant report. If you have questions about that report or really any of the reports, feel free to reach out to me directly at milliganschooldata@gmail.com. Thank you very much.